chance that we can reduce the light intensity a little bit in the room? I got some awesome pictures. If you want to see them. My name is Kyle House. I'm a research geologist at the United States Geological Survey in Flagstaff, Arizona. I have a long background in superficial geologic mapping and alluvial fan environments. Worked at the Arizona Geological Survey for a while in the 90s, worked at DRI after I left there. I worked with Dick French a little bit and had plenty of his late night missives to read every now and then. He's a hilarious guy, brilliant guy. Went out in the field with him a couple of times, and I'm just sad to know that he's passed. Very funny and friendly guy. Currently, I do geologic mapping in the lower Colorado River corridor between Yuma and Hoover Dam to study the history of the Colorado River over the past 5.5 million years or so, and I map a ton of alluvial fans. I used to be really wrapped up in the alluvial fan flood hazard assessment mitigation sphere, particularly with John Fuller, who was the first boss I ever had in my life, aside from my dad, believe it or not, when I lived in Tucson. And it's been a while since I've thought about the alluvial fan flood issue. So what I'd like to do today is just give a real basic background on alluvial fans in general, show some good pictures of them, talk about some concepts about how they develop, why they develop, different ways to interpret what you see when you look at an alluvial fan image like this from Google Earth. And I think anybody in the room will have a better perspective on that when they're done listening to me yammer on and on about this. So it's not going to be technical. It's not a course. It's a show and tell. There are other alluvial fan experts in the crowd that can pipe up and add if they'd like. But before I start completely, I do want to know when I need to stop. John, it's
Kyle, just go.
Just go. Just go. All right. Can we get a little darker? Is that possible?
It's all in the back. Eric, Alex down with it.
I'm sorry. So how's this going to go? All right. Okay. So there's different ways to conceptualize a geological fan. Geological fan. See, that's how I think about it. So I'm completely a geologist at this point. But there are sort of geologic perspectives, engineering perspectives, kind of just layperson perspective. The way I think about them is that it's an archive of environmental change. It's a sedimentary deposit that records the evolution of the watershed that's contributing to sediment and how it's responded to climate variability over time and tectonic activity over time. They're very conspicuous, and you'll be really comfortable with that idea after the talk, I hope. We can just go outside and talk about how conspicuous they are. It's very hot. They're in predictable areas for the most part, typically an upland area sourcing into a valley area. But the scale, the type, and the specific location of the fan are controlled by the geology of the watershed, the regional hydrology and climate, and the tectonic environment. It's sort of it's an accommodation space problem in some situations where a small watershed provides enough sediment to build the alluvial fan, and in a desert environment, typically in a poor hydrologic integration, there's a tremendous amount of space that sediment can occupy. And in a tectonically active environment, there's continuous formation of additional space for these to occupy. Alluvial fan forms below an upland catchment at points of egress from confined channels. Now see, everybody's defined alluvial fans over and over and over. Nobody's used the word or phrase point of egress. So I'm proud of that. They form where expanding flow loses its capacity and deposition enhances the flow to follow multiple flow paths that then progressively lose their capacity and sometimes also follow multiple flow paths generated by the depositional lobe at the point at which the capacity to carry sediment is reduced. You'll often see that it's, you can go to Wikipedia and they're going to tell you, oh, you get a big break in slope and you're going to get an alluvial fan. Well, that's really not the general rule. There's a very large break in slope in the large wavelength topography between the mountain and the valley, but in general, in many cases, the profile of the fan matches the profile of the drainage feed. Not in all cases, but in the vast majority of them. It's really the loss of confinement that matters. So in two dimensions, they're shaped like part of a cone, fan, or pie piece, right? Those are the terms that typically get thrown around. And in 3D, they approximate a segment of cone, right? So they have three-dimensional shape, obviously, and they have concavity of the longitudinal profile like a river, sometimes straight, sometimes slightly concave, and strong convexity of the cross-fan profile. I don't have too many of these text slides, so don't worry, okay? They comprise a large percentage of mountain Piedmont areas. You'll often hear people talk about Piedmont flood hazards versus alluvial fan flood hazard, or as kind of a composite, because the Piedmont is the area at the foot of the mountain in which the alluvial fans accumulate, but they share that space with other types of deposits depending on where you are. They share that space with older alluvial fan remnants. They share that space with pluvial lake deposits, with sand dunes, with things like river floodplains in some cases. They scale according to source area lithology. In general, the more highly erodible the source area rock is, the larger the alluvial fan will be. That's all that really means. There's lots of different graphs that plot these relationships of fan area to watershed area as a function of lithology. And you can find those on Google, I'm sure. Alluvial fans are not specific to the desert. They're incredibly well preserved in the desert. They're easiest to study in the desert. We find them in the desert in North America because the basin range is a big part of the desert, and that is the true alluvial fanistan of the world. It's the basin range province. It is just the perfect recipe to build alluvial fans in an extensional tectonic regime that maintains relief with a high standing upland adjacent to a low-lying valley throughout the entire state of Nevada, throughout most of western Arizona, throughout a very large chunk of eastern California. You find this. So that's why we are so tuned into alluvial fans when you live in the west and the Intermountain West in particular. Alluvial fans convey debris flow events, they convey water flow events, they convey rock avalanche events, they convey a variety of superficial processes that are related to transferring sediment from a watershed from a high place to a low place. You can find examples of all those types of deposits on the same alluvial fan in some cases, and there you will find environments that are conducive to one or more of those deposits at the expense of the other. So there's a wide range of processes that you get, but oftentimes it's controlled by the amount of relief in the contributing watershed and the rock type and the climate. So particularly, I've already gone through that. Alluvial fan stands pretty good. You guys basically just means the land of alluvial fan. There's a beautiful alluvial fan complex in front of the Gillis Range in Nevada. That's somewhere east of Hawthorne, right off highway. I used to live in Nevada, it was at 95. And this has an interesting, very well expressed rangefront fault right here. So that's this white line, that's a fault scarp you can see along the base of the mountains. I mean, the mountain front itself is entirely a fault scarp, but this is the most recent uplift that's occurred right along this sort of blank spot. A beautiful array of alluvial fans coming out. You can see deeply corrugated fans, you can see relatively smooth fans, you can see lighter colored, darker colored. You can see there's a lighter bedrock lithology with a darker bedrock lithology on top of it, so sometimes that controls the color that you see when you look at the tone. But when we look at alluvial fans as a geologic entity that we want to map, we look at the characteristics that time have engendered in the deposits, into the landscape. The color related to the amount of time that's passed, the amount of erosion of the alluvial fan, its morphology, so on and so forth. It's a Google Earth image of the same spot, just to give you a different perspective. Google Earth is really good for looking at alluvial fans if you haven't figured that out yet. Okay, so this will be a little redundant, but that's how we'll learn, right? Repetition. Alluvial fans over time. Well, I'm very interested in the geologic history of a landscape recorded in alluvial fans. All right, so there's a tremendous amount of long-term information that we can glean from looking at these. We can find alluvial fan deposits that are in pretty good shape with extant surfaces ranging back to nearly 5.5 million years old in parts of the Southwest. One of the main things that you need to maintain an alluvial fan, a so-called alluvial fan complex, which is a mosaic of alluvial fan deposits of different ages below the same watershed, is a persistent kind of base level fall or base level control. So active tectonic environment, you're uplifting a mountain relative to a valley, you're creating potential energy in the watershed and you're creating space in the valley for the alluvial fan to accumulate. And that's one way to do it. Another way that you can create base level fall is to have be an alluvial fan on a tributary Piedmont to a large river system like the Colorado River, for example, which can in size and grade tremendously over geologic time on the frame of like 10,000 years. scale of 10 to 100,000 years, you get the Colorado River grading and degrading significantly, creating interesting base level problems for all of its tributaries. And if you think about this, if you also have been to the Colorado River in the Blythe area, it's a very large valley, it's about 9 miles wide. Well, the river has created that space in the last, let's say, 5,000 years. Here, it's a pretty young floodplain surface there. So picture the river on the east side of the valley and the alluvial fans catching up to it that then extend across the valley and grade into the river. And then the river has a very large avulsion or meander, starts to laterally migrate across the valley to the other side. It creates a tremendous local drop in base level. So you get alluvial fans that develop very rapidly in response to that kind of change. Tectonics being sort of the master base level control, river lateral migration and aggregation degradation being sort of secondary, and also alluvial lake formation and desiccation, which is very common in the Great Basin. It's common in this valley that we are in currently. There's alluvial lake, there's a lake linked to the Colorado River, or Lake Coahuila. That sometimes imposes a tremendous base level change on alluvial fan systems. So we're also concerned about how some of the other terms, I have alluvial fan twice, so it's only supposed to show up once. The concept of the telescoping geometry is just incision of alluvial fans into themselves, in a sense. You get a big alluvial fan from say, a large scale climatic event over thousands of years, and then you change the watershed yield of sediment, but you maintain or even increase the amount of water, so you're able to incise that fan and redistribute its sediment down at the toe of the fan that's been abandoned by incision. So you get this sort of telescoping relationship, which is something that you can see in Death Valley in a lot of cases. Pretty much anywhere in the basin and range, you'll find that sort of setup. Some people call that fan segmentation as well. I talked about a lot of these things. We'll move on. Okay, so what is it about alluvial fans that we find so interesting? Well, as a geologist and as a person that likes pretty things, it's a spectacularly well represented landform. It's very elegant. This is a spectacular example of a fan down in Baja, California. It's got the perfect radial shape that you would expect. It emanates, it's got a nice upland watershed. It emanates from a point below that watershed. This one has a remarkably well-developed shape. It actually has a shoreline deposit going along the base of it here. That's what that white line is. It's got some abandoned fan remnants here and here, and it's got an active fault that cuts across it. In fact, that fault ruptured in 2010 or 11, the 7.4 earthquake in that general area. So geologically, they're a fascinating landform. They convey a tremendous amount of information about the history of the landscape, about the activity of the processes that create and then act on the fan. But if you're a developer or the average person, it's like an inverted theater. It's like this perfect thing. Think of the way a theater is organized, where everybody's looking at the stage. So I got a map of some theater, and I put a big bulge in it, and I inverted the curvature. So if you're thinking about building a neighborhood on a fan, everybody's got this great view of the valley, right? So that's, I think, other than that, there's a lot of alluvial fans in this general region. It's this physiographic characteristic that I think is very intriguing to people. And it's a great place to build a neighborhood. I mean, we're at Rancho Mirage, California, right? I mean, it is the most elaborate neighborhoods on alluvial fans that you can find in the United States, if not the world. And they're biased towards these active alluvial fans because they have the best preserved shape. So there are in Google Earth and outside and driving in on the steep road we came in on, there's incredible examples of full-blown development, just crammed up these active alluvial fans. In fact, I'm pretty sure one of them is the poster child for alluvial fan flooding, the Magnesia Spring Canyon fan, which has a giant golf course on it and a ton of homes, and a diversion structure that I hope is scale appropriate. These really are compelling landscapes for a lot of different reasons. All right, so here's a nice view from Panama Valley looking at the Panama Range, and spectacular scene. Alluvial fan towing out on a valley flat that's intermittently filled with water. You can see, see this, I knew these buttons were close together. You can see the abandoned fan remnants, which have this topographic characteristic. They're a little crenulated looking. You can see the active channel coming down the fan, feeding below the, I have a diagram of these terms with the so-called intersection point where it fans out right there. And then a whole series of coalescent alluvial fans along the base right here. Okay, so let's go back to that perfect fan, and here's a couple of several different types of things to look for. So we have the upland watershed, we have the feeder channel coming down the upland watershed. It's flanked by abandoned fan remnants that have been abandoned by virtue of an evolution in the amount of sediment available to the river, but also probably a combination of that with active tectonics and uplift of fan remnants. Because you can see that there are active faults right along the toes of some of these. There's even a trace you can see across the active portion of the fan with the distributary channels that's related to the recent earthquake. So alluvial shoreline, which is an interesting thing. Active faults demarcating older versus younger fan remnants, but also cutting a younger fan remnant. And the so-called fan apex, which is essentially where it emanates. The bulk of this fan is a relatively young feature, and that's where it's emanating from that part of the incised drainage. The intersection point, they've called in the literature a lot, it's really a zone. It's kind of hard to say, oh, I know exactly where this happens, but there's a zone in which you start to go from a single channel to a multi-threaded channel. Right? So you can find that on any of these things. A lot of these features you can find, some are specific to very specific environments. You can see that it's flanked by a whole series of alluvial fans of various sizes coming out of similar drainages that have abandoned fan remnants that have a very smooth and crenulated sort of texture versus the incised active fan. And you can see an interesting thing that alluvial fans, the way they have the radial characteristic, when they meet each other, there's typically a trough, right, a sort of inner fan trough, just sort of topographically forced, that is often the source of yet another alluvial fan. Because it's conveying, you're concentrating some of the flow into that trough, and then as the topography gets less and less restrictive, it fans out and creates yet another fan. I'm sure this is really exciting to think about how to develop something like this safely, because they really are pretty complicated. So I've been sort of hinting about the topographic expression of fans, so I got some great LiDAR data from the Death Valley area, and I created an interesting slope-shaded map, which is a better way than a hill shade, really, to look at a landscape, because there's no dependence upon incident solar angle, right? So every slope has the same kind of shading, so it really makes the landscape pop pretty severely. And the color ramp on it is just a repeating sequence of colors, but it gives you an idea of where constant zones of elevation are. And then I put the contours on for, old school value. And what we can see here is this beautiful radial profile of the fan. Incredibly well expressed old fan remnants, right, with steep scarps on either side bounding the active fan channel and sort of upper fan component here. The coalescence of this active fan with adjacent fan, smaller fans, and I think there's a pretty good example of one of those inner fan trough characteristics. That's a little hard to see, but it's right down in this area. I have a photograph of an area like this that will make that clear as well. So no ambiguity about the topography of the alluvial fan at this point. You can see the whole inverted theater seating thing. It's well defined by the contours. The older fan remnants that are high standing relative to the active fan, also you could sort of reconstruct what that fan's geometry would be by connecting those contours in a logical way, which is a common way to try to estimate volumes of previous alluvial fans, or volumes of sediment removed by the active fan that now cuts through them. And you can also see this is a fault that cuts through this landscape, pretty prominent right here. There's a really nice expression of it in the contours. I'd probably say this a few times, but if you're mapping fans for flood hazard mitigation purposes, get LiDAR data for that fan. Just get it, because it will give you this visualization. It helps you understand the landscape so much better than a contour map or a 10-meter DEM. It's absolutely spectacular stuff, and we need it for the nation, and I work for the USGS, and I wish I could make it happen, but I can't. But I do say that a lot in meetings with people in charge. So let's just look at another LiDAR image. It doesn't have the color on it, but you can still see the topography very nicely. You can see the nature of these active fans emanating from the watershed here. I think we're still in Death Valley. I can't remember exactly where we are, but it's not key. So in GlobalMapper, which is a great program for looking at this type of stuff, drew this quick line to draw a profile across the fans to just further reinforce the fact that they have a very conspicuous cross-profile characteristic, right? And then this is the notion of the inner fan trough that exists. This is right in this area. This is right in this area, so on and so forth. So that's why the alluvial fan, I remember early on talking about alluvial fan flood hazards and how it was mystifying to people that they could live on a hill and still be subject to some significant, absolutely terrifying flood hazard potentially, because it's kind of counterintuitive, I get that. But if you look at images like this and think about the geometry of it, it makes absolutely perfect sense that that's what's going on. And living on the highest point of the hill of an active fan is the worst possible idea that you could have, right? That's the most dangerous place on the fan to live, the one with the best view. So I think these types of visualizations with LiDAR, I've used them in a lot of mapping projects where I had it available, and it's incredibly, if it's done right, it's georeferenced to the sub-centimeter level. It has incredibly good elevation data, and it allows you to build these spectacular visualizations and pull numeric data about topography off it in an instant. And it shows them like, hey, here's what this profile is. This is what we mean. We say it's a fan. It's like a conic segment, and it's a lump. All this stuff makes perfect sense when you look at it this way. Nice example of a similar environment in Eureka Valley, Death Valley National Park, where you have this pretty amazing suite of alluvial fans. Highly exaggerated topography, but pretty sweet image, right? These Proterozoic and Paleozoic sedimentary rocks form this nice backdrop, and they feed these monstrous alluvial fans. And you can see there's one of the inner fan troughs. There's a fan right there, and all the flow gets concentrated into here and then spreads out again. Not only do you get a fan, you get the subsidiary fan related to it in the next one. They're pretty complicated environment, but they're spectacular. So I mentioned that we talk about it as part of a Piedmont. That was an example of a desert Piedmont. So the Piedmont is literally the area at the foot of the mountains, right? We know that. It can include a bunch of different types of geologic deposits and landforms. When we look at it, if the goal really is to say, is this an active alluvial fan or an inactive alluvial fan, we evaluate the drainage pattern present on the fan surface. Is it a distributary drainage pattern? Is it trying to spread flow out, or is it a tributary drainage pattern where the flow is being concentrated into a channel? When it's an active fan that's being actively developed, it has a distributary drainage pattern. It's dispersing sediment and it's dispersing water. Let's say it the other way, but you get the point. A tributary drainage system is something that concentrates water and puts it into a single channel. The minute you turn an alluvial fan off, the geologic minute that you turn an alluvial fan off and abandon that surface, it will slowly progress into a tributary drainage system. And it will look very different because it's no longer being actively maintained. It's just basically, is how I tell all the students I've had, it just sits there and rots in the sun for thousands of years in the desert and gets rained on. And it slowly develops this drainage profile that is a tributary system. And it's a great way to tell those things apart, just in sort of a cursory manner. We also, when we're looking at these Piedmont areas, we check the surface characteristics of an active alluvial fan that are associated with really dynamic bar and channel topography. It is a system that is depositing a tremendous amount of sediment, breaking into different channels that are also depositing progressively lesser amounts of sediment, and they leave a very distinctive topographic fingerprint of gravel bars and sandy channels, or even gravelly channels and bouldery bars. Over time, if you're no longer actively building them up, they slowly smooth through a variety of processes that happen over geologic time while you sleep and create this remarkably smooth, uniform topography. But if you find a situation, I'll show a couple of pictures where you can see a time series of alluvial fans coming out of the same system in close proximity to each other, you can look at that morphology and know, oh yeah, clearly that's the active channel. I've driven my Jeep up that before. But then you can work your way up to progressively older things and see how they can be completely flat. That's the perfect desert surface with a tight pavement, dark varnish, very planar. If you start scratching around on it, you kick up a ton of dust kind of thing. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. So that's the sort of stuff that we look for in the imagery that we analyze and in the field work that we do to differentiate fans by type, level of activity, and relative age. Not too worried about the vegetation. So I wanted to throw this in because it's a cool picture and it will help wake everyone up, because I could ask you to map this and that would keep us up and worried. This is another Death Valley fan complex in Panama Valley that is excruciatingly complicated. in terms of its geomorphology. It has, this is nearly 100, this is more than 100 feet of relief right here, and you can tell that it's an old fan remnant. You can also tell this strikingly, no pun intended, strikingly linear feature is an active fault that's truncating that fan remnant and creating that sharp face. You can see an active, here's the feeder channel, fan apex, active distributary system that then is interrupted by a series of faults that are cutting across that particular fan that then take that perfect sort of radial distributary drainage pattern and force it into a local rectilinear pattern that's dominated by those fault scarps. That's a very common thing to find in areas where the tectonic activity is high and you have good alluvial fans. You will see this complicated drainage interruption by a sort of rectilinear pattern and realize, wow, we're mitigating flood hazards, but clearly there's some sort of seismic hazard here as well because it's controlling where this alluvial fan goes at a small scale. This also has, you probably can't see it, it has this diagnostic kind of ribbed, longitudinal ribbed topography on that remnant that are related to a pluvial lake shoreline sequence. And I'll show you some better examples of those and why those matter in geologic mapping. But I love this because it is a remarkably complicated set. This is a little bit simpler. It's I wanted to show this because it's a close-up of one of these fans in Baja that has this fault cut right across it that cuts the particularly young part of the alluvial fan. You can see the distributary flow network right here with a sort of quasi-riparian vegetation in it. And this is a remnant of it here that was uplifted, at least uplifted more than it may have been by the recent earthquake in the last 5 or 6 years down there. And another nice example of other fans coming in and coalescing with that. And here's a large fan. It's out of the picture, a large fan here. Here's the interfan trough, and there's the fan right there developing below that. So they are complicated sort of compound features in a lot of animals. This is another pretty complicated desert Piedmont area. This is the Wasatch Range near Hawthorne, Nevada, near Walker Lake. If you've ever driven to Reno on Highway 95, you've gone right through here. The Wasatch Range has nearly the relief of the San Jacinto Mountains here. It's about 9,000 feet of relief over a really short distance. There's active fault right at the mountain front here, right? That really prominent line is meaningful. It is a significant fault that's created that incredible amount of separation between the mountains and the valley. You can see an alluvial fan coming out of this valley, fanning out. You see a big gravel pit here. This is Highway 95. So, oh, I see another alluvial fan. Oh, I see an alluvial fan remnant here that's truncated. So there's probably a splay in the fault right here. But what in the world is all this madness down here? There's a lot of relief right here. There's about at least 70 feet of relief related to that shadow, right? So what we're looking at is where this alluvial fan complex was grading into a very large pluvial lake in the late Pleistocene. And these are pluvial lake shoreline features and coastal features like cusps with lagoons in them and things like that. So these are lagoonal sediments. This is a beach ridge. This is a cusp. These are all there. If you look closely, there's a whole series of lines here that are beach ridges. There's a good example of it right there. So that's sort of reinforces the idea that desert Piedmont itself, depending on where you are, is not entirely alluvial fans. There are completely different types of deposits there in some cases that have a very specific age connotation. We know when that pluvial lake was at its peak and when it desiccated. And in fact, some of these are actually historic shorelines because they tap the Walker River for so much agriculture. The lake's dropped about 50 meters in 100 years. But the point is that the Piedmont itself can be a pastiche of all kinds of different things. But we can classify them and interpret them and be pretty comfortable in knowing that we're looking at shoreline features in that case. In fact, my previous job, I made a map of that particular area. So all the pluvial lake is in the kind of bluish green stuff. The fans are in the more earth tones. And there's remnants of higher pluvial lakes in various places on the Piedmont as well. So I'm kind of making a transition into how we think about mapping these geologically, because we could use these features like the pluvial lake features as timelines in the landscape. Some fans are partly obliterated or completely obliterated by those features. Other fans cut right across them. So right there we know, if we're looking at old fans, young fans, how old they might be, how young they might be. And then you have the Walker River, I forgot to mention, flowing through here. So they're all graded to the young fans are trying to get to the Walker River floodplain. So they're actually getting fanning out on the upper Piedmont and then squeezing down through drainages that reach the Walker River. So there is a history there, and it's interpretable, and it's not sort of viciously complicated. Okay, so beautiful picture. This is the Trail Canyon Alluvial Fan Complex in Death Valley on the east side. The road that goes up there, you can camp there, it's kind of cool. This is a great example of, when I throw the term Alluvial Fan Complex around, this is what I'm thinking of, because you can actually intuitively, as a viewer that might not be obsessed with alluvial fans, you can look at this, look at the texture of the landscape. Of course, this is downslope. The mountains are up here off the image. There's 10,000 feet of relief right there. Here's the main drainage. It had a pretty decent flood, moving a lot of fine-grained stuff, maybe a fine-grained mud flow, right? Not too long before they took the image. And these are all the different alluvial fan remnants, and you can tell that they project directly up into that axial drainage, or that primary drainage, right? They're all sort of emanating from that particular source. And if you get good at it, and you can get good at it really quick, you can see where the interface is with alluvial fans and remnants from other drainages, like right there, basically, right? Because this is going to have that big radial hump. This is going to be the hump, and that's the interfan trough right there that ends up conveying its own alluvial fan, right? So this is the alluvial fan complex, and this mosaic of surfaces represents discrete episodes of alluvial fan formation and abandonment over at least the last, let's say, 250,000 years in this particular part of Death Valley. So that's an alluvial fan complex. If you want to build your development, you don't build it here. You look for these things, and you build it on this thing, because that's been isolated from flooding for thousands and thousands of years. I can't tell you that I know for a fact it's not going to get flooded, but I can tell you that I know for a fact it hasn't been flooded, and it's probably a heck of a lot easier to protect from flooding than it is if you just put a grid right there. And there are lots of grids right there. There are so many in the Las Vegas area. There's a lot in this area. I'll show you one, and Marty showed this picture around Littlefield. Well, that fan was hammered by a flood a year ago, right after they put in the roads for a development. So I have some pictures of that to show you that I'm not making this stuff up. It's sort of amazing, because I think this is pretty straightforward. If you can believe me that, hey, I bet I could draw a line around this thing based on what house was hammered about that day. It looks pretty straightforward. And so there, bingo. I did that this morning really early with PowerPoint of all things. Like, oh, well, I could map this thing with PowerPoint, my mouse. It's pretty good, right? So then, think about looking at all those different remnants that were slightly different colors and had different textures. Well, that is actually a sign of their relative age. And so we can use that to further break that down into a nice multicolored geologic map that is faithful to the relative age, potentially even the absolute age if we get really lucky, of each of those fan remnants. So those fan remnants that look so different are just this, they were once basically exactly like this thing. They just have been abandoned, and they have tributary drainage nets forming on them. You can see there's channels that are concentrating into single channels on these things. They're not doing this massive distributed flow like these guys down here. They're very different. They're also truncated by a alluvial lake shoreline, and then they also have a very sort of sand-rich distal end where some spring discharge occurs with enough regularity to show up. Another typical component of alluvial fan. All right. So I tried to transition to geologic mapping of fans because that's what I really focus on. We are interested in the absolute ages of fans the best we can get them, because we want to understand if they link to what we know about global climate change. So we have, for example, I won't belabor this point, but there's something called a marine isotope stage where we know what the isotope ratios are with oxygen 16 and 18, that they can be back sort of interpreted as a proxy for global ice volume, which is also an inverse proxy for global sea level. And so we have pretty good control on how old those different isotope stages are. And the better we can tighten the age estimates of these fans, the more closely we can relate it to what we know about global change to see if the alluvial fans are responding in some predictable way. And that's something that we just do a lot of research on, because we're still struggling with that. But there are certain ages calculated with some interesting methods involving cosmogenically derived isotopes and fan sediment profiles that correspond with prominent oxygen isotope stages. That might be as far as I go with geochronology, because I know that's kind of dry and scary. But here's this is the correlation diagram, we call this. This is kind of like, these all have to be on the geologic map. They all have to relate to each other in the same way with respect to time as implied here. So here we have a remarkably nonlinear time scale that goes from 0 to 5.33 billion years, all right? So trust me, it's excessively nonlinear, but if we showed it to scale, you wouldn't be able to see the most abundant map here. So it's almost like inverted, right? So this is an example of something I did in Panama Valley, Nevada, where I did for the Clark County Regional Flood Control District. I made this big geologic map of the whole valley and interpreted it as a sort of first order flood hazard map, not like a risk probability map, but like a yes, no, maybe kind of a map. And we looked at the same kind of work people had done in the Providence Mountains in the Mojave, the Spring Mountains outside of Vegas, and overall in Vegas in the 100K sheet, and related our units to that. So that's just one way that we conceptualize the unit. So if you look at the map, you'll see those colors spread out all over the landscape. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because there's an interesting fact that I'm going to call it a fact. It's a quasi, sort of nebulous, embryonic fact about alluvial fans I think we're learning in the southwestern United States. The oldest fan surfaces we can find may barely get into the Miocene. So we're looking here, this is in millions of years, so this is 12,000 years. That's the beginning of the Holocene, right? It's the end of the Pleistocene. I don't want to make this sound ridiculous, but the point is that this represents about 5 million years of Earth history, which is a tiny amount of Earth history. It's almost laughable. But in the southwestern United States, we can find extant features on the landscape that extend that far back in time and are still in their general configuration they were when they were deposited, right? When we talk about hundreds of millions of years, we've involved all kinds of different paleogeographic things. But in this case, we're looking at landforms that are sort of coming out of the watershed they were originally deposited by. In fact, one of the oldest landforms that we know of so far is Mormon Mesa, which is a giant triangular thing between the Virgin and Overton Arms of Lake Mead that is this massive calcrete soil that is about 5 billion years old based on tephra that we have in the deposits that it's formed in, right? So I made this just on a lark because it shows the difference between my perspective and your perspective, most likely. So this is a sort of bogus relative abundance diagram that's showing as the wider it is, the more abundant something is. And this is spanning the domain of time in which we can find alluvial fan deposits at the surface in the southwest. Well, it's a tiny little pinpoint down in the Miocene because those are really rare. There are some in Ivanpah Valley, there are some in, like I said, in the Mormon Mesa Virgin Mountains area, and there are some in the Colorado River area, up near Lake Mojave on the Arizona side, for example. But as we get younger and younger in time, we start to see more and more progressively younger fans. But we're still here. We're at 126,000. We're at 780,000 years. And then we're at 12,000 years. But some of the dating that has been done systematically in the Southwest has shown that there is a really large number of alluvial fan remnants that date between about 120 and 70,000 years. Okay? So that's an interesting thing. And that shows that in that particular time frame, the vast majority of the older stuff had been wiped out and sort of replaced with this 70 to 100,000 year old fan unit. That's also a period of time in which the Colorado River deposited this very widespread unit called the Chippewa Formation. And if you spend any time on the Colorado River, you've seen these big bluffs that are hundreds of feet high that are really have these badlands at the base, and then they have this sand across the top. And you can find it all the way down the system from Sandy Point to Yuma, and that's the Chippewa Formation. It's about that same age as well. Sorry about that. So that's an interesting thing. But in general, we worry about how many fans we can pull out of this whole spectrum. And it's typically kind of dominated by this time frame. And of course the young time frame, but this one is interesting as well. But in terms of the hazard concern that we're focused on, in terms of active versus inactive fans, taking a conservative approach, it's really just this tiny little interval on this particular scale. So the Holocene fans and the latest Pleistocene fans. Generally the areas that are either just obviously active or so intertwined with the active environment that they're potentially active, so thus hazardous. So when we're making a geologic map, we focus on this primary depositional topography and fabric. There's a very distinct channel and bar characteristic I told you about. We'll look at some pictures of that soon. That's what the fan is, that's how the fan's created, and it occurs at multiple scales. It occurs at the fan apex. It breaks into a series of distributary channels. They form those types of features with their own almost fan apex kind of thing. I'll show you a LiDAR image that makes that sort of frighteningly clear that it's almost this self-similar type of a landform. But over time, you abandon that fan, the deposition is shifted through avulsion or through incision and building this sort of telescoping fan. The surface sits there, rots in the sun, gets rained on, it gets a soil formed in it. Aeolian sediment, in particular, windblown dust accumulates, and that's what actually contributes to the formation of the pavement that you may be familiar with. And the pavement is the potentially remarkably tightly packed single grain layer of stones that are varnished black that sit on these alluvial fan surfaces. Those are the things that we're looking for. The pavement darkness, the varnish tonality is a function of time. If you have the same lithology, the same rock type coming out of a watershed, the degree of varnish, the degree of getting darker, basically, is a function of time. It's a time-dependent thing. The degree of the drainage net development from distributary to tributary is a function of time. The amount of carbonate that accumulates in the soil is a function of time as well. So everybody in this area knows about caliche and things like that. We call them a petrocalcic soil, or we get really nerdy and call it a BKQM soil. They're massive soil carbonate horizons that took thousands to hundreds, well, tens of thousands of years at a minimum to form. Cross-cutting relations. If you took a Geology 101 class, you interpreted the diagram of the sedimentary rocks are faulted and they have a dike injected through them, all that stuff. Well, you can see that in a superficial environment. You can see what fan cuts what fan, so on and so forth, which fans are cut by pluvial lake deposits, which fans are cut by faults, which ones are not. All of those things are hints as to how old these are. In a relative structure at a minimum, ideally an absolute structure if you can get direct dates on the fan deposits. That's a whole different talk, but I might mention a few things about it. All right, well, there's some fresh depositional topography in alluvial fan in Eureka Valley, California. We're looking down towards the valley axis. We've got a very prominent sort of fine grain dominated channel, and we have these spectacular gravel, coarse gravel bars at different levels adjacent to it within the channel. That is just a classic look. When you look in Google Earth and you see the bright white area on Alluvial Fan in Death Valley, that's what it looks like. That's the place you don't want to build your house, but you might want to drive your Jeep. That's these guys. That's this area, right? So I had mentioned that we look at that topography. So we go from something that's rough to something that's very smooth to something that then is kind of rough again, because as these landforms evolve over time, they go from I'm active, oh, I've been abandoned, now I'm going to progressively get flatter and I'm going to form a really nice soil, and the time's going to go on, and the tributary drainage network is going to be deep enough to create a steep slope. We're going to start to erode that landform. So you find that where you see this remnants out on the fan called byenas, because they look like whale backs, and they're just these old, high, rounded ridges of alluvial fans that have gone past their abandoned prime. They've just been completely eroded yet again, and then they might even get a retrograde surface that has a pavement and another soil forming in it if you're going into the millions of years time frame. So I mentioned the color of the varnish is a very interesting thing that's easy to see. It has a gradation that's a function of time, but it's also controlled by the lithology. Some of the rocks coming out of the watershed might be dark to begin with. Some of the rocks coming out of the watershed don't attract the varnish like other rocks. So there's some rocks that just don't varnish worth a damn, and there's some that just get ridiculously dark. So we're looking here and we're seeing, oh, I don't know if I'm looking at houses weird varnish thing, or if it's those colored rocks that are contributing to this, and so I'm having trouble interpreting the straight up morphology of the fan. Well, you get some LiDAR data, and that's the same area. And you can see what I'm talking about with respect to rough depositional topography, smooth abandoned topography, right? Really smooth. These are beautiful things, right? Look at that. This is a fault that has offset this. Here's another. There's a strand of that same fault. You can see it's got this high abandoned fan rim. It's very smooth, has a dendritic drainage network, which, if you think about it, ironically, the alluvial fans, you just take the dendritic network and turn it on its head, and it's the same, it's like this bizarre mirror image, right? Sort of the coupling of the base and the fan that geologists like so much. So this is another shout out to LiDAR data because you can really get a sense for the characteristics of this fan. You can tell it has this radial profile in this image. You can see there's this main channel, and right below it, oh, there's this kind of triangular depositional lobe. Oh, look, there's another one of those depositional lobes. Hey, there's some more. Oh my God, it's like, hey, this fan is completely made up of depositional lobes of sediment. And it is. It's how they're made, right? And you can see them really nicely on this. And you know that, okay, here's the main channel, and it's feeding out. This, the last thing it did, we'll say, is this guy, but for this to be one, maybe that was right before that, maybe that was long before it. But at some point, this channel had to be on a different part of the fan to feed out those same types of loads. Same thing on this guy, same thing on all of these things. So this is the topography that these started with. There might be a difference in the caliber of sediment for some reason. It might have been a time frame back in the Pleistocene where you're generating higher caliber sediment. But in general, you start with this, you end up with this. You start here, you go to here, right? You can still sense those lobes in this, but you can tell, it's not nearly as rough as this. And then you look at something like this, and it's incredibly smooth. And here's an example of this one is smooth, but it's being eroded to where it really is just preserving this single ridge. So we've got a particularly old landform there. So that criteria, I can sit down, and several of you in this room can sit down and make a pretty good map of this fan complex in a couple of hours. Right? It's very straightforward, and you could do it with the imagery, but you wouldn't be nearly as confident about some of the subtle differences as you can be by looking at the LiDAR data, because it really brings it out. And anybody that's doing engineering studies on the hydraulics of this alluvial fan wants topography like this. My God, so much better than what you can get with, there is this thing called structure from motion you may know about that you could use aerial photography to get something close to this. But this is amazing stuff to work with. This is another example. Same area. This stuff you can get on Google Earth through the INCOM. It's called opentopography.org. Provides links to these data and also just those hill-shaped maps. You can look at them in Google Earth. If you're involved in studies anywhere, go there and see if they just happen to already have LiDAR. So take a look at this, and you can see this fan is dark, but it's the fresh fan. It's just coming out of these dark rocks. This fan is light colored. It's coming through those dark rocks, but it's being fed by a lighter colored parent rock up here, right? So this is actually a pretty good example of this color, this tonality problem that you're going to run into if you just focus on tone as a mapping criteria, because you're mapping the source rock lithology and not necessarily the relative age. So if you look at it this way, you can tell, oh yeah, that's all the young fan. Oh, I can see a little older fan remnant trapped up here. It's pretty common to find them sort of flanking the incised channel near the apex. I can see this weird hump, which I would be willing to bet is fault related, right? And then the fans, you have these nice active fans that squeeze down into an older fan remnant that's quite a bit older and is probably related to another type of faulting, another fault in farther down the Piedmont. I don't know the history of this area, but that's a pretty safe interpretation. And you can see this interesting, almost ideal dendritic drainage that's developed on a planar fan remnant that used to funnel through this. So you're seeing this sort of same kind of landscape evolving over time. And this has served as a conduit for the fans that are now these remnants up here, just as much as it serves for a conduit for these. And in another example, you can see this crazy, almost sawtooth faceted texture on these. It's almost like a tessellated texture on these fans that are there. You can see it in stereo photos, you can sense it in the field, but this sort of visualization, which is the hill-shaped approach, not the slope-shaped, but it still really brings it up. That's my point. Okay, as I always do my slides, like 3 slides in advance. I covered all of these things. We're just looking for all these things that show how much longer a certain fan remnant has weathered than another, to figure out how to classify them for mapping purposes. And that's what all those things reflect. Let's look at some real-world examples. This is I can't remember if this is Trail Canyon Wash or Johnson Canyon Wash in Death Valley, but we've got the big babies back here, 11,000 feet or so, and we're getting close to sea level. We're looking up this active channel, and we see these big gravel-dominated features, right? big gravel bars. These are sort of these expansion blobs of gravel. They're in the active channel, but they're very close. They're just flanking this darker version of exactly the same thing. So that's been inactive long enough to get a fair amount of varnish cover on it. Not only do you get, the varnish is just sort of a manganese oxide that is somehow biotically fixed and accumulates on these rocks. It's probably transported in the air in some way. They're pulling particulate out of the air. Maybe some plants are working it in. I don't really understand it, I have to admit. But in addition to that, the clasts are weathering by thermal breakdown, by salt dissolution. So pitting and carbonate rocks, and salt dissolution in Death Valley in particular is it can really break down large rocks very fast. So you've got this comminution and attrition process in which you're making the large rocks smaller over time. You're actually transporting stuff small distances from the high points to the low points in the bar and channel environment. Enough rainstorms, you're going to be doing that. You're going to winnow out the fines, and they're going to accumulate. And the sort of the craziest thing to the average person that I've talked to about alluvial fans is that the aeolian dust that is in the atmosphere, when it accumulates at a rate that is extremely detectable on a 10,000 plus year time frame. So you have this constant fallout of dust from the atmosphere that blankets these fans that are not being actively built and forms a distinct, conspicuous layer in the soil horizon of just fine dust, and has that single grain desert pavement forming on top of it. So that is actually, in most cases, the desert pavement that you may be familiar with is related to the incorporation of aeolian dust particles into the soil profile and actually lifting those clasts slowly off the parent deposit. It's an inflationary surface and an inflationary process. There are examples where deflation by wind, which is kind of what most people go to just intuitively and has been discussed, can be a part of that, but in general, it really is related to the accumulation of wind-blown sediment. And it could be sediment from the Gobi Desert. I mean, this sediment goes a long way in the atmosphere. But if you happen to be near what was once a pluvial lake, that lake dries up and it is a monstrous source of dust. So you'll get extremely well-developed pavements on the downwind side of a dry lake basin. So there's some other local and regional factors that control how well these pavements develop. Okay, anyway, that's a very interesting thing about desert pavement if you didn't know it. It's been demonstrated in several studies, and if you go out and dig, go out onto a perfectly flat varnished fan surface or digging around, the first thing you're going to do is kick out a huge amount of yellow to orangish dust. Okay, it can be a real mess. So just camp right on the pavement if that's what you're doing. Don't clear space. Nice fresh alluvial fan on, I think that's another one in Panama Valley, and a nice blow out right here below. Sort of, it seems like what you want to call the intersection point or fan apex. Fan apex for the whole landform would be up in here. Intersection point for that event is right there. But I think we can all agree that the location of where it goes from single channel to multi-channel is going to vary as a function of flood magnitude, for example. It's going to be a function of whether this is a debris flow dominated fan and the channel can actually get plugged by a debris flow, because that is a solid, that's a very complicated rheological substance that can stop on a slope and just fill a channel, whereas water will continue to flow. Jeremy's going to show us tons of that stuff, so I'm not even going. Okay, what I wanted to show you here is another really interesting thing.